Those of you who might not be familiar, these are the dolls of Edith Flack Ackley, or dolls that were made from her book or her kits on doll making. Edith Flack Ackley was a doll maker. She was a puppeteer, an author, and as I said, she designed numerous kits and patterns for both McCall's and Women's Home Companion. Now, Edith Flack Ackley was born in 1887. She grew up in Long Island. She was the oldest daughter, and her sister was Marjorie Flack, who wrote such books as Make Way for Ducklings. And this is a picture of her around 1920 or so. And I love this picture because she's smiling. In so many pictures of her, she is extremely serious, does not look like someone who would be fun to be around at all. But this is a lovely picture for her and highly unusual. She apparently was fun to be around, by the way. Anyway, when she got out of school, she went to New York and studied at the Art Students League. And there she met her husband, who was a jeweler, or studying to be a jeweler. They married and they moved to Greenwich Village in New York. She had a child in 1918 when she was 31 years old, which of course would have been extremely late at this time. Her daughter's name was Telka, which, if you're wondering about the name, Telka was actually a very popular board game in the period. So I guess she's lucky she wasn't named Parcheesi. Anyway, when Telka was born, she made her first doll. And we don't know what her first dolls looked like. We do know that she sold them in gift shops in Greenwich Village. And this is a very early doll of hers. And it's a little unusual. It's not like the dolls that we tend to know as being Edith Flack Ackley. And in many ways, they're exactly like that. But she has this sort of one-piece body. But what's also interesting is there's a certain degree of bash it out, crash it out. If it doesn't read from the middle of the house, it doesn't matter. Theatrical technique here. A lot of the edges are not hemmed. They're just frayed. And you can see this on the various edges here on the velvet. And then there's this strong use of bright colors against a dark background, which is of course also very theatrical and also very typical of Eastern European embroidery as well. Now, during this time in Greenwich Village, puppetry was extremely active. The puppeteer Tony Sarg was active at that time. He is considered to be the father of modern American puppetry, really revived marionettes in particular. And Edith Flack Ackley seemed to have caught that bug, and she became a very active puppeteer during this period. And this picture also shows the very serious side of Edith Flack Ackley. Now, this picture is amusing because this is a picture in her apartment that she rented in Greenwich Village. She wanted to have a puppet theater, so she just knocked a hole in the wall without telling her landlady and made a puppet theater so that if you were in the living room, you were in the audience, and if you were the room next to that, then she was manipulating the puppets. These are some of her puppets. It is unusual to find this many puppets of hers. Actually, until I discovered these, I had only knew of one other puppet in existence, which is in a museum on the West Coast. But you can see how much expression she was able to get out of a very simple cloth puppet. A lot of detail here in the faces. And these would have been very theatrical in that they would have looked wonderful from the stage. The faces were strong and they would carry. I just want to point out there's this jester here, which is the same jester as here in her book on marionettes, which is the first book that she published. And you notice that this has drawings by Marjorie Flack, her sister. Now, they lived in New York City, which during the summers at this period would be very hot and sticky and miserable, and they still had horse-drawn deliveries, so it was also smelly as all get out. So she would teach, and her husband would teach at a summer camp up in Maine, and she taught puppetry. She also taught doll making, and this pattern is based on the dolls that she had the kids make up in Maine. This is one of her earliest patterns. It's by McCall's. She is credited on this, and these are very large dolls. They have that one-piece sort of gingerbread body, which, just to give you a quick look at what that looks like, here is an undressed doll, so you can see what that looks like. And so this was one of her early commercial ventures. As I said, she had the marionette book, which was extremely popular, and like her doll making book, this was in print until the 1970s, which is a very long time for a book like this to be in print. And also the back of the book, there's fold out patterns for the puppets. So if you're ever looking for this book, make sure the patterns are included. Another early McCall pattern is this one, which is very hard to find because it actually duplicates most of the material that was in the book. And so the publisher sent a cease and desist notice. This was pulled and pulped, and very few copies of this exist. So unfortunately, in 1929, her husband died, and she needed to support Telka. And she did this by going into doll making with a vengeance. Now this is a boudoir type doll that she did with the pattern, McCall pattern, for doing it. Now this doll was actually made by Edith Flack Ackley. I purchased it from the family. So, and you can see the little pointed feet that seems to be characteristic of her early dolls. So, as I said, she needed to support herself. She had the puppetry as an income, but she needed more to be completely self-sufficient. So she started making dolls. And these are early dolls from this period in the 30s. And you can see that they're very charming. They're very simple. Some of the quality is a bit irregular. I mean, that face could have been better. This face is adorable. The small size seems to have been popular. This doll is interesting because she painted the arms and the head and chest white, as if she was trying to duplicate a China head doll. So these dolls also went into another venture for her, was making kits. These kits came out in 1934, and this was part of a series of Christmas gifts that were pairs. You can just see the pair of playing card pillows And so this was a kit to make these two dolls, which is supposed to be these dolls here. But transferring her work to the kit was not terribly successful. You can see this is the printed muslin you would have received in the kit. And these are sort of what the faces turn out like. This is actually one that I was doing, so it's somewhat better than normal, but these dolls were extremely popular, and these kit dolls are found quite often. She also did this book, which many of you may know, Dolls to Make for Fun and Profit. This was very successful. Again, it was in print until the 1970s. Many of you who are of a certain age probably remember when this was the only book in the library, or just about the only doll book in the library. And one of the reasons I think this was popular is that Edith Flack Ackley had a very conversational tone. She was speaking directly to the reader. She used I a lot. There was a lot of personal stories involved, and this was extremely popular. Just a little side note, if you buy this book, oddly enough, you need to get the second edition. And the reason you want the second edition is it has all of the patterns for doing her hats. We'll get to the hats a little later, but the first edition, or the early editions, have just a bunch of blank pages in the back. I don't know why they did that, but you can tell it's the second edition because it has a yellow background, whereas the early one has sort of an off-white background. But if you're going to buy a copy, I suggest you buy this. The rest of the contents are exactly the same. Now, interesting also, this book was printed in England, which of course would have been unusual at that time for something to cross the pond like that. She, during the 30s, made other books. There's Doll Shop of Your Own, and this was based on her own experience, because when her husband died, she moved back to Long Island, and she opened a doll shop in her home, which is what she suggests. She says that since dolls are used in the home, they should be sold from a home. And this gives detailed descriptions on how to design a shop, how to do packaging, how to make doll stands, display, just about everything that one could possibly want to know. She also did a book on holiday cards to make, and she did a book on paper dolls, which is a wonderful book on paper dolls. So going back to her dolls, you can sort of see that they have very simple faces. The features are done very economically with very few stitches, very fine work. The fabric used is something that's called Japanese crepe, and it was a very cheap fabric, but it had a stretch to it. It was used for Halloween costumes and things like that, but it had some stretch, and that's probably one of the reasons why this kit doll didn't quite work out, was that they didn't make allowances for the stretch of the fabric that Edith Flack Ackley used compared to this unbleached muslin. And this is common when you try to make a doll from the book. It'll often turn out looking very skinny and thin, and that's because if you use unbleached muslin, it doesn't have the stretch that she had in using the Japanese crepe. Now, She went on to do numerous kits for Women's Home Companion. This one here is for a little girl's Christmas. This doll also apparently had the name of Melanie. A friend of mine owns a lot of Edith Flack Ackley's papers, and according to one letter, 77,000 of this kit was sold. So this is an advertisement for the kit, as it would have appeared in a magazine. And this is the kit that one would have received. And you can sort of see again, there's that one piece sort of gingerbread man pattern that is typical of her dolls. And the kit included the hair for making the dolls and the printed cloth. And what's interesting, let's see if I can find it underneath here, but the pattern pieces were actually iron-on transfers for this kit. Now, you also notice that this is the doll that was used for the advertisement. And here are three of them, which all look relatively similar, but look very little like the doll here. And again, that's because the fabric that was in the kit did not have the stretch that the original doll would have had. Now, the second doll was Peggy. This is Peggy. I think it was called For a Good Little Girl. And this kit was not as successful. Sorry, that's Martha in the background. And only 11,000 of these were sold, so it's a much harder doll to find. She also did a kit for marionettes. This is extremely hard to find. There's a clown, there's a little girl, and then there's a Santa Claus. And then there's a little script inside that gives you a story you can tell about a little girl on Christmas Eve waking up and finding Santa Claus and a dancing clown doll. Now, in 1936, she remarried. She remarried a man by the name of Stowe Wedgenroth, who was a well-known lithographer. And his lithographs are considered some of the best in America at this time. He was also 20 years younger than Edith. But because she had a little more financial stability, her dolls became a little less assembly line. And you see a lot of creativity in some of her dolls here. And this is probably really the heyday of her work. Now, also about this time, her daughter Telka was a young adult, a late teenager, and was an artist in her own right. And so Edith Flack Ackley and Telka would do doll and watercolor combinations. And here is an advertisement for one of those, or an announcement. And you can see the doll and the watercolor here. Now, this is an example of Telka's watercolor and a doll. And unfortunately, this is the problem with her dolls, is they're very fragile and they don't do well under strong light. So this doll needs a lot of restoration, but this is the doll that's supposed to be in that picture. They also did a line of greeting cards, which were very popular in the 40s and 50s. Now, as she got older, she continued to make dolls, and you can see these are later dolls of hers. And you can tell that they're later because, among other things, the faces are a little lower on the head. The heads themselves can be quite square. Obviously, some of the fabrics just scream 1960s. She's still doing the bonnets, which I mentioned earlier. I mean, her little bonnets were all made by hand. She made them herself, and they really add a lot to the dolls. And then she also did some of these very small dolls, which again would be very popular with collectors. They're small, they could go in doll shops or be a doll for a doll. Now, one of the problems with researching Edith Flack Ackley is that her daughter Telka was an unreliable witness for a lot of things. And I interviewed her in the early 80s. Other people have interviewed her. And one of the things she said is that Edith Flack Ackley never signed her dolls. This is not true. She would either use a ribbon with her name in ballpoint pen in the 50s and 60s, or earlier, you can see on this doll, that there is a label here that indicates it is an Edith Ackley doll. So some of her dolls, very few of them, but some of them were in fact marked, and it's something to look for. Also, this hiding behind here, this is an ad, and from the late 30s or 40s, and you can see the Edith Flack Ackley doll here. Her dolls were used in several ads because they were attractive, but they weren't really licensed, and so they didn't have to worry about someone coming after them and saying you have to pay a royalty, such as would happen if, say, you used a Raggedy Ann, or definitely anything by Disney. Now, unfortunately, as I said, the dolls are fragile. This is often the condition that you will find them in if you do find an original Edith Flack Ackley. This doll I have primarily because it's the only doll I've ever seen that's hers that has the eyes done in this fashion and the mouth done in this fashion. You'll notice that all the other dolls have these little dot eyes. And also this doll is really the only other one I've found that does not have black eyes. She has brown. So that's a variation. And her dolls often have this sort of, gray, beige, grayish hair color. That's very typical of her dolls. Her last kit was Dorinda. And let's pull out Dorinda here. So, in fact, let's literally pull out Dorinda so we don't have glare. But this is for Dorinda. This is from the 1940s, and it's a life-size doll that came with material and trims and everything to do a matching dress for a little girl. And so this is Dorinda in all of her splendor. She is a very big girl, about 32 inches. Also notice that she has hands with fingers, which is unusual. And also notice that the face on Dorinda actually goes back to this very, very early McCall's pattern. So basically it goes back to this pattern. Oop, from the late 1920s. Had a little gimbal malfunction there. So that was that. Now, like a lot of people who do something well, people do knockoffs or take her work and put it off as their own. This book, Marionettes Are People, is basically her marionette book, with the patterns slightly altered so that you could use them on muslin and not worry about the stretch. This is a British doll making book. I think it's Margaret Hutchinson, but you can see that these are Edith Flack Ackley type dolls. This book has an Edith Flack Ackley pattern in it, but she at least gives her credit at the beginning of the book as a source. This is a Bucilla kit. I have no idea if Edith was involved with this or not. She does not get any credit on it. These patterns are McCall's, and they could be hers. She's not getting any credit here, or they could be based on her work and someone else developed them further. As I said, she does not get credit. And this doll is a WPA doll, and it's called a Counterpane Doll. I'm going to turn it this way so maybe you can see a little better, get a little more in the photo. These dolls were made to use up every last scrap of fabric from making the large WPA dolls. And this is basically a deconstructed Edith Flack Ackley. First of all, you can see the Edith Flack Ackley characteristics to the face. The torso is Edith Flack Ackley. The head is has the straight top that is gathered together. The legs are Edith Flack Ackley. The feet, even though the fabric is pieced, that is turned by hand. There isn't a gusset there like the Georgine dolls. The hands are separate, the arms are separate, but they're done in the style of Edith Flack Ackley with the hands that have no thumbs. Now, these are more dolls that were done by various people other than Edith Flack Ackley, just to give you an idea of what some people did. This doll I particularly find lovely. She has a very, very sweet face. You really wouldn't think of her as Edith Flack Ackley unless you looked closely at the hands and the feet. But this is actually the second kit pattern that was used here. So this is how someone took the existing kit pattern and changed it to make what is a completely different doll. These dolls are by an artist named Ruth B, 2 words, and she took the Edith Flack Ackley pattern and then did a lot of needle sculpting on them to make character dolls. These dolls, we do not know the artist. They're fairly common. She must have been very prolific. They're always this sort of Little Women type doll. And this is another artist who seemed to have had some sort of business making the dolls. This doll is from the dollhouse in Vermont, and it is an Edith Flack Ackley pattern out of the book. You can see that it's actually the figure that's on the cover of the book, but they took the Edith Flack Ackley head and put a mask face over it. And this is her tag from the dollhouse. These dolls are from a woman named Lucy Geist. And the story goes that Lucy Geist was a lighthouse keeper. And so she would make these dolls while she was on duty in the lighthouse, and then she would sell them at the Women's Exchange for Work in Nantucket. So these dolls are pretty common. Her faces are very distinctive. You can see that they have these nylon stocking socks for all of them, and the sort of very square head. This doll is done by a friend of mine named Teresa Mom, and she does these tiny, tiny little dolls beautifully. She usually sells at the UFDC convention. She will be there this year in Nashville. And these dolls here are dolls that I have made at one time or another. And Rachel had asked, how did I get interested in Edith Flack Ackley? Well, I got interested in Edith Flack Ackley through the Ruth Gibbs dolls. These dolls really sort of reminded me of Edith Flack Ackley and Ruth Gibbs. Ruth Gibbs were dolls that were made in the 1940s in Flemington, New Jersey. The pottery work was actually done in Ohio, and they were a very popular sort of rich uncle doll when European toys were not available in the US during the war. And they usually came in gift sets, and they were sold by F.O. Schwartz. So at one time I was collecting these because I lived in New York and they were local history. And actually from there, a friend of mine gave me this Edith Flack Ackley doll because she saw the similarities. And that's actually, this is the doll that got me started with Edith Flack Ackley. And so because of that, I, of course, had to try my hand at this, and this doll here with no clothes is an early attempt of mine. I have to get her dressed. These dolls, I actually made to sell, and among other things, they were sold at Virginia's gift shop in Knott's Berry Farm. If you're from the West Coast, you probably have heard of Knott's Berry Farm, if not Virginia's gift shop. And because of the connection to the Ruth Gibbs dolls, yes, I sold them as Godey's Little Lady dolls. Okay, well, not exactly kosher, but that's what I did. This is a later doll. I think I made it in the 90s, maybe. She's unfinished, as so many of my dolls are. She's made out of a rayon crepe, and you can sort of see the difference between a fabric that has some stretch and a fabric that doesn't. These would both have been made from the same pattern, but you get a very different shaped head when using a fabric that has a little bit of stretch to it. Now, the other thing that Rachel asked me was about the prices. And I really hate to give dollar amounts because everything can vary depending on region and a lot of other considerations. But also, the problem with Edith Flack Ackley dolls is that their pricing is entirely subjective. Obviously, condition counts for a great deal, and a doll that is in excellent condition is clearly going to go for a lot more than dolls that are in less than excellent condition. And even, sort of this yellowing on this girl's dress would affect her value considerably. But that's about the only definite consideration for these dolls. Rachel had mentioned at one point something about size. Size is completely irrelevant. It's really, if it's on an auction, who's bidding? If there's a doll that's particularly lovely and there are two people who are interested in it, the price will go really, really high. If it's a doll that seems a little more common or just doesn't have the appeal, or, perhaps in the case of this girl, the face is a little wonky or not really appealing, the price will be lower. The only thing I can tell you about the dolls is that dainty is perhaps the key word. This girl's falling over a little bit. One of the problems with these dolls is there is no commercial stand that really works for them. So they tend to either flop over or have some other problem. But like this doll with her floral fabric, very fine cotton, fragile looking, artificial flowers in the hair, velvet ribbon, this doll would fetch a higher price than, say, these dolls that are in sort of calicos. They still have the hats, there's still artificial flowers, but they're later dolls with the face lower on the head. Again, this doll, as sweet as her face is, she has a lot of soil on the dress, and the clothing is always, or almost always, sewn on. So cleaning these dolls is nigh impossible without completely remaking them. So, it's hard to say. So a doll, say one of these, say 14-inch dolls, could go anywhere from $100 to $400, depending on the appeal and the fabrics used and the entire package. The dolls that have these sort of Kate Greenaway outfits tend to go for much more than, as I said, the ones that have just little cotton dresses. In these tiny dolls, if the doll was used on one of these greeting cards, of course the value goes up. So that's basically all I can say. If I didn't answer that question sufficiently, you can pose another question in the comments and I'll do my best to answer it. So, and I don't know if I actually got this one in, but it's a good thing to leave you with. This is a watercolor that was done by Edith Flack Ackley. So far it's the only one that I know of, and this is her work, not her daughter's. So this is a good place to say goodbye, and again, if you have questions, please leave them in the comments, and I will do everything possible to answer as many of them as I can. So anyway, thank you very much, and I hope you're all enjoying the convention.